Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. "Mommy, I'm cold," said 5-year-old Kelly said calmly, mundanely. Not complaining, just giving information. She was the one who cried at first, but then somehow even accepted their new life. Not for nothing they say that children quickly adapt to everything new. Perhaps Nancy Mom Girl was even harder to get used to the fact that over the past year, hunger and cold have become integral parts of their lives. "Be patient for a while. Daughter," affectionately she said, trying to hide the traitorous shiver in her voice. "They'll bring the stove to be heated. Porridge for their own. Everything will be all right. My darling." "I know," Mom replied Kelly confidently. "Let me help you with the firewood." No, I got it," Nancy hastily replied. She stepped out of the decrepit shed and tried to make sure her daughter didn't see the tears on her face. It wasn't hard to do. The only light they had was provided by an old oil lamp. Of course, it was simply not capable of properly illuminating all the rooms, and often Nancy thought it was for the best. The shed was cramped with one single window under the low ceiling, where instead of the long drunken glass they put simple polyethylene film. True, in several layers. For better heat preservation, the sunlight penetrating inside became dull and dreary, perfectly harmonized with the shabby furnishings of the room. The only furniture here was 2 narrow beds, a small closet, an old stove, which served the mother and daughter as a stove for cooking and heaters. The only consolation was that the barn was solid oak logs, so it was in no danger of collapse or a hole in the floor or ceiling. In fact, it had been used as a temporary home for the family a long time ago, before they built a new big and spacious house, because it was not easy to live here, but it was possible. Nancy herself, come to think of it, had grown up in more difficult circumstances, though that fact was hardly a comfort to her. At first, though, she had been about the age that little Kelly was now. Everything in her life was fine. She herself, of course, did not remember those times very well and relied more on her mother's stories. She often recalled what a wonderful man, husband, and father Nancy's late father had been, working and then not helping and babysitting when he had time. And of course, he loved Mom very much, just as she loved him. And they lived, as they call it, soul to soul without any quarrels and scandals. They raised their daughter, saved money for a larger apartment, planning that soon little Nancy would have a brother too. The only thing that marred this relationship turned out to be Nancy's mom-dad. Her mother didn't like her mother-in-law from the very moment the young people met each other, and she didn't even think about hiding this fact or trying to get in touch with her daughter-in-law and get to know her better. She was the kind of woman for whom their children, especially their sons, make up their whole world, are the meaning and center of all their dull and gray life. Such see their offspring's partners not as their personal happiness, but as their misfortune, and see them as rivals for their precious child's attention. That is why Nancy and the mother had no chance to get along with her mother-in-law, though she tried her best to do so. She tried everything. She came to visit with flowers and candy and tried to find common interests. Even had nothing against the fact that her husband all weekend spent not with her, but with his parents. Everything was in vain. Any contact between them ended in an ugly scandal arranged by her mother-in-law. Nancy's father, caught between the 2 women he loved, was also unable to find ways to reconcile them, despite his best efforts, so he shuttled between them, trying to give each of them enough attention without offending the other. Maybe it's the constant tension. That's what ultimately caused him to pass away too soon. Yes, in addition, for the reason that rarely takes young people away, he was not yet 30 years old when a heart attack brought him to the grave. Nancy's mom, of course, grieved terribly, but had no idea that major trials were yet to come for her. A few days after the secret father was buried on the doorstep of their apartment, the mother-in-law showed up. Mom at first even rejoiced at this visit. She decided that there is a blessing in disguise. Maybe now, having lost her son, the woman will show at least some interest in the only reminder of him that remained in this world, his daughter, and consequently, her own granddaughter, whose existence she had not even noticed until then. Of course, after all that there could be no more warm relations between the two women, but perhaps they would have turned from openly hostile to neutral and calm. But that wasn't the case. The mother-in-law had other plans, and she didn't come to reconcile with her daughter-in-law and share her grief. "What's up, bitch?" She started right from the doorstep. "You've gotten your way and you've driven my son into the grave." "Miranda, what are you talking about?" That Molly, the mother, was confused. "What I am saying is the truth I am saying. I always knew this was how it would end. From the moment I saw you, I knew it right away. This girl will ruin my Leshchenko. He must run away from her." But he did not listen to me. So he paid for it. "Miranda, I understand your grief, but you're unfair to me." "Oh, unfair," the mother-in-law exclaimed. "I'll show you justice. Such a viper." She literally threw in her daughter-in-law's face some very weighty folder. And while the thin mother opened it and tried to figure out what it all meant, she continued her monologue. "Take this." She nodded contemptuously at the little Nancy with frightened eyes, looking out of the cradle at the whole scene. "And get out of my apartment so you won't be here before tonight." "What do you mean out of your apartment?" More surprised. What did Nancy resent? "Mom, we bought it when we were married. It is a jointly acquired property, which now belongs to me and our daughter, your, by the way, granddaughter. And you look at the documents," said the mother-in-law. "And what? Just so they gave you the apartment?" Leshchenko wrote on me. At least on this, he had enough brains. And that, you see, jointly acquired while my poor son humping at work at 12 o'clock a day. "You've been living off the books here, haven't you?" Of course, the daughter-in-law could answer that she worked before Nancy was born. She even went on maternity leave just before she gave birth, and before that she worked as hard as her husband. But she wouldn't do it. In the first place, because it was useless to argue with her mother-in-law. She would not listen to any arguments anyway. And secondly, the woman simply did not have the strength to say anything. The fact is that she still looked into the folder and made sure that her mother-in-law said the truth. The apartment, according to the documents, belonged to her. And this could only mean one thing. From that moment on, both she and her young daughter were homeless. What followed was several years of unrelenting hell. They moved around in some communal apartments, often changing them as the rent went up. The mother's small salary was barely enough to support them, and there was no one to help them. After all, the woman was an orphan. Her strength was only enough to somehow drag her only daughter to adulthood, for which she was very grateful. And even the day Nancy turned 18, her mother went to meet her father. Her heart, too, could not bear all the strain and turmoil that had been heaped on her fragile shoulders. So she was left alone. Now she had to earn her own living, the good of all that was needed. Her mother had time to teach her, and in addition, showed her a perfect example of how carefully one should treat the choice of a life partner. And the very young girl promised herself that she would never repeat her mother's mistakes and would not allow her children to live in such conditions as she herself had to live in. Because of constant moving, Nancy often had to change schools. Often it turned out so that she only had time to get used to the new place, but had to break off again and go to another neighborhood, or even the city. Of course, under such conditions, she studied not too well, and the question of entering the university in front of her did not even stand, and the early death of her mother made it impossible for her to get a higher education. To feed herself, the girl had to get a job right after graduation. She was lucky. Probably the first time in her conscious life, she managed to get a position as a sales consultant in a very expensive clothing store. Of course, the work was hard and quite boring, like any unskilled labor. However, it was still a better option than getting a job as a cleaner or dishwasher. And the salary she was offered was quite decent. With that money, she could even rent herself a decent room. One of its main advantages was that it could be locked from the inside. Nancy's life was very monotonous. Work, home, work again, and so on. The girl didn't have too many weekends, and it could be called her personal choice. She herself took a large number of extra shifts to get more money. In those days, she earned as much as her mother had never dreamed of. However, like many children from poor families who had a very difficult childhood, she had fallen into one of two extremes between denying herself everything and fanatically hoarding money for emergencies and mindlessly spending it. Nancy chose the second option. The thought of not buying something she didn't really need but could afford was almost physically painful. Fortunately, she did not get into any loans and debts and lived quite well within the means that she had. Nevertheless, Nancy spent all her salary without a trace, often on things that were not necessary at all, on pretty brooches, bracelets, trips to cafes, movie tickets, and other pleasant trifles. Often she told herself that it would be good to start saving. Even once she thought that if she limited herself to only the really necessary things, she could have already saved, for example, for the first installment on the mortgage, or just create a very substantial safety cushion. In her mind, however, realizing how important all of this was, Nancy could not bring herself to start saving. Emotions whispered to her that she was doing just fine now. There didn't seem to be any emergencies. She was doing well, so she could not be afraid of dismissal, as well as, for example, the ruin of a very popular chain of stores, one of which she worked in. And every time she listened to her emotions, which were stronger than the voice of reason, of course, then scolded herself for it, but could not fix anything, and only promised herself that from the next paycheck, she would definitely begin to behave more reasonably. Which, of course, never happened. That's how she lived until she met Charles. He came into her store, completely unplanned, in the mall where Nancy worked. He was supposed to have some very important work meeting, but on the way out, his pants were rolled up with mud by a passing car driver. Here was a man looking for more to his good fortune. Charles arrived at the meeting well in advance. It turned out that he didn't have a typical clothing size, and Nancy spent almost 40 minutes trying to find some pants that would fit the man more or less decently. Finally, she succeeded. He was satisfied with the quality of service and promised to come back for more shopping sometime. Something to brighten up the long search. Nancy and Charles were having a very lively conversation, and if at first it was just about the weather outside the window, then they talked about other topics, including the fact that they liked the same music and the same movies, and found some more common ground. He came in again 2 weeks later with a coffee stain on his jacket. In a strange coincidence, it was Nancy who served him again. When she saw that the customer had the same problem again, she couldn't help but laugh. To her surprise, Charles was not offended at all. On the contrary, appreciating the ridiculousness of the situation, he joined her. "And you excuse me," Nancy said at last. "It's just that it's really kind of funny." "You don't say." He echoed a second time in the same place. "And you're here again. Either your mall has some kind of enchantment or the universe is subtly telling me that it's better not to deal with these partners. Don't think this happens to me all the time. Honestly, 2 weeks ago was the first time in my entire life. Or maybe it's our store that's bewitched." Nancy smiled. "Attracted to you. It makes a certain amount of sense," Charles replied. "But it's probably not the store itself that attracts me, but one of its charming employees. To tell you the truth, I've been thinking about you all these days." "Oh, that's very nice," Nancy said. "And I think I'll answer frankly to frankness. I've been thinking of you too. I think we had a very successful conversation last time," Charles confirmed enthusiastically. "Well, if that's so, let me ask you when your next day off is expected." Nancy had never been so happy about the end of the month. They had extra shifts at the beginning of each month. That's because she hadn't had time to pick up any extra work yet. And the next day off she had to come in just a couple of days, and she informed her new acquaintance about it. Their romance developed rapidly. Both of them never believed in such nonsense as love at first sight, and both of them found it. Already in a month they were practically inseparable, spending all their free time together. Nancy, to the surprise of her superiors, even stopped taking extra shifts. Of course, formally it was not a prerequisite for work, but everyone had already gotten used to the fact that the girl always helps out her colleagues. In addition, it was accepted in the store, albeit unspoken, that a certain number of extra hours were taken by all employees without exception. And now, when Nancy decided to work only those shifts, which were assigned to her under the contract, in the team began serious conflicts. The girl still performed her work well, not giving the bosses the slightest reason for her dismissal. However, no one could prevent them from depriving her of her bonus, which was a large part of her salary. And her coworkers started to shit on the smallest things, literally making her stay in the store completely unbearable. Nancy, in spite of everything, did not even think of giving up. She continued to simply perform her duties, despite all the difficulties and obstacles. However, with her new salary, she was no longer able to afford not only entertainment, but even to rent a room. From Charles, Nancy hid her problems to the last. But of course, he could not help noticing the changes taking place with his favorite woman. "Nancy," he said one day, "I'm sorry, of course. Perhaps I'm minding my own business. But there's something that's been bothering you a lot lately. Is there anything I can do to help you? Or at least just listen? Sometimes it can be really helpful to talk things out. Just a little trouble at work." She waved it off. "Nothing particularly serious, right?" Charles asked, looking at her intently. "Right." Nancy tried to answer firmly and confidently, but her voice shook involuntarily. Charles continued to stare at her without saying a word. He realized that the matter was much more serious than she was trying to make it seem. But he also realized that if he questioned her, Nancy would simply shut herself up and certainly not say a word to him. So he waited patiently for the girl to gather her strength and tell him about her problem. And so she did. After a few minutes of tense silence, Nancy, tired of pretending, burst into tears at the table of the cafe where they were sitting. Charles embraced her and started stroking her back and head, letting her know that he was near and ready to support her in any situation. Finally, she calmed down enough to speak, even though her words were jumbled. "Pity with them," sobs behind them. "You see, it's actually because of you. I mean, I'm not saying it's your fault. In fact, you had nothing to do with it at all. I mean, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. Nancy, just tell me everything from the beginning." "From the beginning, yes," she echoed. "You see, when you and I started dating, I stopped taking extra shifts at the store. It's not technically illegal, but I understand," Charles echoed. "But they can't fire you for that, can they?" "Of course they can't fire me, but they can take a pay cut. I don't know how to live on the money I get now, not enough to buy food or rent a room. I'm afraid that I'll soon get into debt or something like that. I have absolutely no idea what to do in this situation." "What do you mean, what?" Charles was surprised. "Quit. If the conditions are so unbearable, is there any point in putting up with them?" Nancy tried to object, but the man didn't let her say a word. "I understand what you're saying. That's exactly what they want. If you fire them, they all kind of benefit. So be it. Do you want to work in a group like that?" "Oh, no." Sadly, Nancy sighed. "And I hadn't even thought about it. But if now I have enough money for food or shelter, when I quit, I won't have enough for anything. And it's not like I'll be able to find a new job anytime soon." "Well, first of all, I'm sure you can. As far as I can tell, you're a pretty good salesman. There's a lot of talent out there. I think your employer's competitors are gonna have a field day with you. And secondly, why would you want to live in a room with strangers? Come to my place. I think this step in our relationship has been a long time coming. I've been hesitant to invite you, and my income is enough for the two of us." Charles, "Well, it's a little awkward, Nancy. I don't want to sit on someone's neck, especially not on the man I love. I'm not dating you for your money or your business. Don't worry, honey, I'm well aware of that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making you this offer. It wouldn't be a pleasure to have you in my apartment." Still, Nancy was not ready to accept this generous offer so immediately. For another 2 weeks, she walked around pondering whether she should move in and quit her job. The rapidity with which their relationship was developing was somewhat frightening to the girl, but in the end, she made her decision and agreed. After all, Charles was certainly right about one thing. She would be able to find a new job anyway. And if things went wrong in their life together, she could rent another room and move out. So why not give it a try? It often happens that when people start living together, they quickly find out that they are actually incompatible. There are domestic conflicts, or even it turns out that it's not very easy to bear each other in a small piece of space every day. In the case of Nancy and Charles, it was nothing like that. On the contrary, when the two moved in together, it was as if they had become even closer and closer to each other. The wedding was fast approaching. There was only one thing that confused the girl. Finding a new job was not as easy as they had thought it would be. Nancy was really a good saleswoman and had learned a lot while working in her store. She had everything one could wish for: experience, knowledge, skills, and an innate quality suited to this line of work. Nevertheless, no one wanted to hire her. The girl even began to suspect that this is a kind of greeting from previous employers who gave her a disgusting characteristic. However, most likely, it was something else. She was even too good for her job and had the appropriate salary expectations, and no one was willing to pay her the money she was asking for. It was easier to hire less talented girls who were able to do some work, but who wanted less money. But of course, no one talked about it openly. Otherwise, Nancy might have reduced her appetite. But alas, she had no idea that this was what had to be done. "Come on, Nancy," Charles urged her. "I told you 1,000 times what I earn. It's enough for the two of us, even the three of us. I mean, when we decide to have a baby. And if something happens to you, would you mind?" Nancy, oh, what could happen to me? Get hit by a streetcar, or a brick fall on my head. So something like that can happen at any time, including before you even get a job. You can't be safe, honey. But it's worth a try. Well, see, you've been trying for a month now, and it's no use. Well, at least for the relay race. You deserve a vacation. Let's get married. We'll go on a vacation, and then you can go on with your search, if it's so important to you. In the end, Nancy agreed with her fiancé and went into wedding planning. She wanted the celebration to be perfect, so she tried to think about every little detail. Then it was time to meet Charles' mother and her future mother-in-law. Frankly speaking, this moment with Nancy was postponed to the last. But now, on the eve of the wedding, it was quite impossible to avoid it. Unless, of course, we take into account the absurd variant, when they will get acquainted directly at the solemn event. The fact is that Nancy was terribly afraid of meeting her future mother-in-law. I remember the terrible experience of my own mother and paternal grandmother. She understood perfectly well that if the relationship does not work out, will come to an end, and her romance with Charles, no matter how much she loved him, it will be impossible to live constantly expecting a blow in the back from his mother. She will certainly be expecting it, even if those fears prove unfounded in the end. This, in turn, may well spoil the relationship and with her husband, and even lead to a painful breakup. So it would be better to break this connection. At once, it will be less traumatic for everyone involved in the events. Of course, Nancy did not share these concerns with her fiancé. He might have taken them to mean that she herself was prejudiced against his mother, though it was not so at all. On the contrary, she sincerely hoped that she would be a nice, kind woman, and that they would be able to find a common language. Charles, who was very sensitive to his bride's moods, did not ask her about anything this time. Of course, he could see her excitement, but he wrote it off as the usual wedding condition peculiar to many women. He even considered himself lucky. The future spouse, not crying all day long, is engaged in some quite constructive activity. Good for him. Besides, in these hectic weeks, Charles was working much harder than usual. He had to get the money for the wedding trip he had already promised Nancy, and he had a great deal of business to attend to so that nothing would fall apart in his absence. After all, being the owner of his own firm, That's a big responsibility. And so the day finally came when Nancy was to meet Charles's mother. From the very morning, she made a fuss, cleaned the apartment, which already shone with crystal cleanliness, cooked, even did the laundry and then dried it with a hairdryer. You can't show a guest and hang her son's underwear out to dry. Nancy, honey, don't be nervous. You said so, and Charles. I'm sure Mom will like you without all this preparation. And if she doesn't, trust me. I've known this woman for years, Charles said with a laugh. Besides, if she doesn't like you, she won't like you. And what will it change? The main thing is that I love you. And my mother doesn't have to. Nancy bit his lip painfully, but kept silent. It didn't matter to him. And from her point of view, if not everything was at stake, then a lot was at stake. It was this meeting that would determine whether their wedding would even happen and whether the relationship would continue. But of course, it was not worth it to frighten Charles with these thoughts beforehand. It was enough that she herself was on pins and needles. At exactly the appointed hour, the doorbell rang, and Nancy hurried to open it. On the threshold stood a woman, quite friendly looking, holding a cake exactly like the one the hostess herself had bought for the table. She had no time to realize whether it was a bad sign or a good one. The girl on the machine politely said hello to the Bones and invited her to come in. As it turned out, a little later, the same confectionery turned out to be a good omen after all. Molly, the mother-in-law's name, laughed when she saw the same cake on the table, and then happily concluded that since they had similar tastes in sweets, they would somehow manage to agree on everything else. She was a cheerful and pleasant woman. By the end of the dinner, Nancy was chatting with her as if she were an old friend whom she had known since childhood. The bride's mood was rapidly improving. Nothing was going to stop her from marrying Charles, and it was definitely the best news of her life. They had a very modest wedding, not even because they were against noisy and left-field celebrations. It just so happened that there was no one in particular to invite to it. Nancy's parents were long gone. She had no time to make friends. Charles, head over heels in his business, didn't have too many friends either. His father, as it turned out, had died a few years ago, passing the family business on to his son. "What happened to your dad?" Nancy asked me one day. Charles instantly became as serious and focused as the girl had never seen him before. But it was not even this that struck her, but the fact that his face showed not only sorrow, but extreme thoughtfulness, as if his father's death were not a personal tragedy for him, but a mystery he could not solve. You see, it was a strange story. They said he had a heart attack. He was only a little over 40. My dad wasn't even 30 when he died of a heart attack, noted Nancy, who didn't find that fact particularly surprising. Yeah, but mine was perfectly healthy. And I'm sorry, but you told me yourself he had a busy life, stress, and all that. And I doubt he was as obsessed with his health as my constant running around to doctors, mandatory annual checkups, that sort of thing. And he made me and my mother get checked. And there was no sign that he had any heart problems. And then all of a sudden he had a heart attack. It's really weird. But you don't think somebody killed him, do you? Poisoned him or something? Honestly, that's what I think. But why? I mean, you ended up with the business. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been yours for years and you're fine. Could there be any other reason? You're right, of course. Maybe I was just overreacting. I did go to the police, but they didn't find anything suspicious. Seeing how hard it was for Charles to think about the story, Nancy never spoke of his father again. After all, even if he did die of causes other than natural causes, it was unlikely they would ever know the truth, although she personally thought it more likely that the man had actually had a heart attack. All sorts of things happen, including to perfectly healthy people. After the wedding, Nancy and Charles went on a fascinating trip to Europe. The girl, who had never been abroad for a month, came back from there filled with impressions. She felt absolutely happy. She had never experienced such emotions in her entire life. Now, however, they were back in their hometown, and life flowed as it should. Nancy resumed her search for work, which remained as unsuccessful as ever. True, it didn't upset her so much now. She was sure that her husband would help her through any difficulties. And indeed, she felt like she was behind a stone wall. A few weeks had passed since their return from their wedding trip. When Nancy found out that she was pregnant, she hurried to share this joyful discovery with Charles. But his reaction was not what the woman had expected. She had hoped that he would share this happy moment with her. But instead, he almost started tearing his hair out. "Charles, honey, aren't you happy we're having a baby? You wanted one too, didn't you?" "Didn't you?" Charles sighed. "I still do. I really do. I don't mean that. It's just that it's a terrible bad time." "What do you mean?" Nancy was worried. He looked long and earnestly at his wife, as if assessing what was worth saying, what was better left unsaid, or maybe he was just gathering his strength. The woman could clearly see how hard it was for him. And besides, she remembered some other facts that she had not paid attention to before. For example, that after Charles returned from Europe, he worked even harder than he had just before the wedding, and certainly more than before. At the very beginning of their acquaintance, and it was supposed to be the other way around. He had settled a great many things before he left, and now he should have been freer. Was it a mistress? A traitorous thought flashed through her mind. Nancy immediately brushed it aside, and was even ashamed that she could have thought such a thing. But what mistress indeed? When would he have had time to get to know her? If they had been together all the time lately. Unless it was before they were married. But then what was the point of getting married? No, it's obviously something else. I mean, Charles finally said, "My business is falling apart. And all I've been doing since we got back is trying to stop this avalanche with my bare hands. I'm sorry. I didn't want to bother you, so I didn't tell you. But now that you are, well, I'm obligated to notify you so you can decide what to do about the pregnancy." "What do you mean by that? What can I do with it?" "Well, maybe it's not the right time for a baby. I'm guessing you don't have much time left." "So no," Nancy interrupted sharply, realizing what he was getting at. "No, darling, whatever it is, I don't intend to get rid of our child. We're going to raise him well anyway." Charles agreed obediently. "But keep in mind that I may soon be left with literally nothing. And now, I'm not even sure I can get a decent job fast enough." "But how could I?" Nancy shook her hands. "Everything was fine when we left, wasn't it? Or did you just not want to upset me then?" No, you've got it right, haven't you? Things were really good and great back then. I don't know how that could have happened. And in just a month, it's a total nightmare. I won't bore you with the details, but there's been some weird tax fraud. And a bunch of other irregularities. I can assure you, I didn't know anything about it. And now I'm trying to find out who did it, and if there's anything I can do about it. Yeah, Nancy sighed. I should probably do something to catalyze my job search. Don't get me wrong, I trust you. But from what you're saying, I don't take offense. Honey, you're absolutely right. You may have to be the one to provide for our family for a while. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, you're not. It's what I envisioned. I understand, honey, but we're a family, and we have to work through things together. You remember for better or for worse. Of course I remember. Charles smiled. But no matter how hard the man tried, he couldn't do it. According to his own apt expression with his bare hands, to stop a snow avalanche, the prosperous business that his family had built for generations collapsed almost in an instant. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Charles never managed to find out who exactly inside the firm was involved in various money frauds. And all the formal strings, of course, led back to him as the business owner. So he was threatened with a considerable prison term under the criminal article. And to avoid this, it was necessary to pay off the numerous debts in which his company was mired. Charles had no choice but to sell the apartment. Nancy told him without a moment's hesitation that since there were no other options, it had to be done as soon as possible. But where would we live? In despair, exclaimed her husband. Where to live? You and I will figure it out, she answered decisively. But what will I do if you go to prison for the rest of your life? I can't even imagine. Here to the rescue of the young family came Molly, who offered her son and daughter-in-law to move to her in the village. My house is a big place. There's enough for everyone, she said. So let's not have any of your objections. You'll be my helpers again. It's a big farm, and I'm not young. I could use an extra hand. And when you get back on your feet, you'll move back to town. If you want to, of course. The young people had no choice but to agree to the proposal. By then, Nancy was long past the point of no work. She hadn't been able to find anything until her belly became too obvious. After that, of course, it would have been foolish to try. No employer would want a pregnant woman, and even late in the pregnancy, on their staff. As for Charles, he came to his senses pretty quickly. He had no time to write. His wife depended on him, their future, the child that was about to be born. A month after the disaster, he found himself a job. Of course, not at the same level as before, as a manager in some small firm. Hopefully, a little more sweat later, looking for something better. I had to go to work, of course, from Molly's village to the city. It wasn't a long way. But that fact couldn't stop Charles. After all, a vegetable garden is a vegetable garden. But you can't eat vegetables alone. And he was simply ashamed to sit on his mother's neck, though she would hardly have minded if he had spent some more time looking for something. Nancy, not wanting to sit idle, actively helped her mother-in-law in the household. Of course, the tasks she was given were not the most difficult, the kind that could not harm her or the future child. She also regularly traveled to the city, despite the long road, which every day became harder to bear. But the woman rightly reasoned that to refuse to see a doctor regularly, even under these conditions, would do more harm than good. Then little Kelly was born. To Nancy's surprise, Molly was in no hurry to take any part in her granddaughter's life. Of course, the woman didn't expect any help from her mother-in-law. After all, she had helped them out enough as it was, so she had every right to rest. After all, she had already canceled her diapers when she was fiddling with little Bones. Nancy was amazed. What Molly was showing to Kelly was complete indifference. Didn't want to play with her, or even just look at the little girl. Of course, she didn't mention it. Not to her mother-in-law, not to her husband. Things happen. Maybe the poor woman was so tired of their presence that she no longer wanted anything. But time went on, and they continued to live in Molly's village house, and neither Charles nor Nancy could find work. For the first 3 years, though, she didn't have time to do it. And time was not playing on her side. Now, in addition to a dubious departure from her previous job, she has a gaping hole in her employment record of almost 5 years. And a small child in her arms did not add to her employer's favor. Charles, on the other hand, remained a simple manager. He could not get a more prestigious position. After all, he was the owner of the company, which had prospered for many years, and under him scandalously ceased to exist. Of course, inside the company where he got a job, his talents were appreciated, but there were simply no opportunities for him to be promoted. Yeah, don't worry, Molly told them. Stay with me as long as you need, for the rest of your life. I know it's a difficult situation, and they're not strangers. They're human beings, and they lived. What else could they do? And, in general, they lived quite well in the fresh air, in a good house with fresh vegetables, grown with their own hands. They had enough money for everything they needed, and the landlady seemed to be only happy to have them in her possession. The only thing that every year more and more worried Nancy was rapidly approaching the time when Kelly would have to go to school. Of course, it was good for a child to live in the fresh air, so to speak, in harmony with nature. But to get up at 5 o'clock and go to the city for a lesson is not very convenient. In the village, there were simply no educational institutions. However, no matter how it was, there was still enough time to think of a way out of this situation. In the meantime, you could live in peace and enjoy your happiness. After all, by and large, everything was fine. She and Charles, As promised to each other on the wedding day, together overcame a difficult period, and now together entered a joyful and carefree. The trouble came completely out of the blue. They were celebrating Kelly's 4th birthday. As always, just the three of them. Molly, as it always happens, refused to attend the party, referring to some urgent matters. The couple had long ago stopped paying attention to this quirk of hers. She wasn't very young after all, and she was entitled to her little oddities. Right at the party table, Charles began to feel sick. First, he began to breathe heavily, and just a few minutes later, he fell to the floor, grabbing life by the chest. Frightened, Nancy immediately called an ambulance, and the long minutes of waiting dragged on. It was not until 200 hours later that paramedics were able to reach their backwoods home. They looked at Charles and were talking excitedly amongst themselves. They began loading him onto a stretcher. No one paid much attention to Nancy, as if she wasn't even here. The ambulance workers showed some reaction only when she took her daughter in her arms and started to climb into their car. "So, lady, where are you going?" One of them asked sternly. "I'm the wife of your patient, and I'm going to the hospital with my husband." "Oh, okay. But why bring the child with you? What's a little girl gonna do in the ICU? Watch her daddy die." "What do you mean, dying?" "Literally, he's having a heart attack. And it's been too long since the attack. We're gonna do everything we can. But I'm not gonna get your hopes up. He probably won't even make it to the hospital." Nancy froze and didn't realize that the ambulance had already left. The doctor's words just drowned her out. She felt as if she had been hit on the head with a very heavy object. How is it a heart attack? How is that dying? What the hell is this? Aren't there too many deaths around her for that very reason? And how will she live without her Charles? Molly, to her surprise, reacted quite calmly to her son's condition, and even to the words of the doctor, who could hear as well as Nancy. As soon as the car left, she calmly went on with her vegetable garden chores. As if nothing had happened, she just said something in passing. "What can you do? It's hereditary. His father also died early and, alas, of the same disease. You probably know that yourself. But he's your son." Nancy couldn't stand it. "How can you be so calm? Do I have to lie down and die too?" shouted the mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do about it?" "I don't think so. So why worry for nothing?" Nancy, startled by her words, went back into the house. She didn't know what to do. To go into town. But she hadn't even been told which hospital Charles was being taken to. Not that there were very many in their little town, but to run to all of them, and with a baby. I mean, even now, it's unlikely her grandmother would even agree to look after Kelly. It's not the smartest thing to do. But she couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. In the end, all she could do was pace the room, feverishly thinking about what to do, how to help Charles, and how she would live if she couldn't help him. She was unceremoniously interrupted by a phone call, which was probably the 100th time she had thought about it, but had not yielded any results. With trembling hands, Nancy picked up the phone, and before answering it for a while, just stared at it. She had already guessed what she was about to hear, and it was as if she were trying to delay the inevitable. But of course she couldn't delay it for too long. "Hello? Hello? Nancy." "Yes," she answered in a shaky voice. "It's me." "Nancy, you have a call from the 3rd City Hospital. Is it about your husband? I'm authorized to inform you that the doctors did everything possible to resuscitate him. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, your husband passed away. I'm sorry for your loss." Nancy had absolutely no recollection of her time. The next hour, I think she sobbed, rolled around on the floor, and almost banged her head against the walls. And it seemed that her own life had ended along with Charles's, that there was no point in her continuing to be in this world. And there's no telling how long it would have lasted or how it would have ended if it hadn't been for Kelly. Scared. The little girl had absolutely no idea what was going on. They were sitting around, celebrating her birthday, and everything was just fine. And then in an instant, everything fell apart. First, something happened to her dad, and now her mom went crazy. For a long time, she hoped all this madness would just go away. But Mommy kept rolling around on the floor and crying bitterly, and little Kelly had no choice but to join her. The sounds her daughter began to make brought Nancy to her senses rather quickly. She sat down on the floor, not exactly calmly, but at least already quite aware of what she was doing, and pressed Kelly against her, albeit briefly, but still she had forgotten even about her, and now she felt guilty. No, this was her raison d'etre. She may no longer have a husband, but she still had a child she was responsible for. Aha, you've calmed down at last, Molly grumbled. Molly quietly appeared in the room and said to Nancy, I must tell you, Lord, how did Charles die? The woman replied indifferently, Yes, I'm following in your footsteps. I told you I wasn't going to waste my energy worrying about it. Nancy made no reply. She could not understand how one could be so calm about the unexpected death of one's own child. Could it be some kind of defense mechanism? Maybe the mother-in-law had not yet fully realized what had happened. Everyone reacts differently to such shocks. She can't really feel nothing. Oh, by the way, Molly, meanwhile, now that you're awake, let's start packing. What do you mean? I don't get it, Nancy. What do you mean? What? You don't think I'd let a stranger stay in my house, do you? You were my son's wife. I'm nobody, and I don't see any reason to keep you here any longer. This shocked Nancy even more. It was exactly the sort of thing she'd been trying to avoid for the rest of her life, and it was exactly what she had finally arrived at. And all of a sudden it occurred to her that it must be a birth curse or something. Otherwise, how else to explain that now she had to repeat her mother's fate? But let's say I'm a stranger to you. Though all the years we've known each other, I've been sure of the opposite, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Kelly is Kelly. After all, she is your granddaughter, the daughter of your only son, who is no longer alive. And I'd already told you that I don't like children, and I'm not going to take care of them. I don't want your Kelly here. But where are we going? You know very well I have no home, no job, no relatives. Well, my dear, you should have thought of that before. Why should it suddenly become my problem? Nancy didn't know what to say to that. She had already realized that appealing to this woman's candid feelings was an absolutely useless venture. All this time, she had been hiding her true nature behind a mask of benevolence and friendliness. But now the need to pretend was completely gone. She looked at both the woman who had just lost her husband and her daughter, who was her own granddaughter, with a completely blank stare. Well, all right. Molly suddenly softened. We have an old barn on our property. We lived in it when there was no house. It's cramped, of course, but there's a bed and a stove. It's just enough to get by. You can occupy it for now, but don't let me see you in the house. In fact, don't try to see me too often. Thank you, said Nancy. It wasn't much of an option, of course, but it was better than going out on the street with her daughter. Thanks. You won't get fed up, Molly said, considering this shed you're renting from me. Yeah. Don't interrupt. I know you don't have any money. You'll do all the work in the summer, chop wood in the winter. You'll do all the little errands. For that, you can live in the barn and take a small share of the harvest. All right, Nancy agreed. She couldn't see any other way out. It would be easier if she were alone. But she was also responsible for her daughter, so she couldn't just proudly raise her head and walk away into the unknown. So at least the child would be in the relative warmth of safety and nourishment. And so it was that she and her entourage began to live in that very shirt. Nancy thought that the hardest thing to explain to her daughter would be what had happened. Why did they have to move from a spacious house to this squalid one? Where was her father? And why they would never see him again? However, to the woman's surprise, the girl herself started this difficult conversation, showing herself beyond her years, wise and understanding. Mom, she asked, when they were settling into their new place of residence. Dad's dead. We won't see him again. I'm afraid so, Sunshine, Nancy replied. It's just you and me now. Then said the girl seriously, I'm going to take care of you now. Daddy always said that if anything happened to him, I'd have to take care of it. Ah, dumbfounded, thought Nancy. How could you know something and not tell me? But you did try to prepare the child somehow. Well, perhaps that was the right thing to do. At first, the woman hoped this existence wouldn't last too long for them. She would get a job, not as a saleswoman, but as a cleaner, and she and her daughter would be able to return to the city, yes, again in some rented room. And what to do? After all, she lived like that with her mother, and nothing too bad had happened. However, the more time passed, the more it became clear that it was impossible. Called on her household work took away both time and energy. It became obvious that under such conditions she would not even be able to look for a job. But if not to fulfill the terms of the contract, she and her child would simply end up on the street. A completely hopeless situation. Gradually, Nancy came to terms with the idea of living. This is how they will have a few more years until her daughter grows up a little and will be able to help her in the household. Of course, it would be bad to exploit the child in this way, but it would give her at least a chance to find a job and return to the city. At the same time, the woman began to prepare Kelly for school, although she didn't really see how that would be possible. At the very least, she was ready to teach her herself, although this option seemed to be the worst of all possible. After all, she didn't know as much as she should, and she wanted to give her daughter a better education than she had received, so that at least she would not repeat the unenviable fate of her older relatives. For now, Nancy slowly taught her daughter to read, count, and write. To her surprise and joy, Kelly turned out to be a very imaginative child and grasped everything literally on the fly. By the time she was 5, she was already able to read syllables and print letters and do simple math calculations. The latter, it seems, was very fascinating to the girl herself. So a little over a year passed. Nancy was still trying to make some plans to return to normal life, but every day they seemed less and less realistic. She was beginning to think that there was no way out of the vicious circle in which she and her daughter found themselves. But help found them, coming from a direction from which no one could expect it. It was shortly after Kelly's birthday. It was late at night, and the girl had long been sleeping peacefully in her bed. Only Nancy had no time for sleep. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, she looked at the photograph of her late husband and cried softly so as not to wake her daughter. From the moment they had been forced to live in that barn, it had become a kind of daily routine for her. More accurately, a nightly ritual. During the day, she had to be strong, had to work, and take care of her daughter. She had no time to grieve for Charles. But at night, she could afford to grieve enough. And on one such night, something strange came to Nancy's sensitive ears, like the creaking of a new wicket gate, not somewhere far away, but on their property. It alarmed the woman. She knew for a fact that Molly never went out at this hour, and she never had visitors. So what was it? Did thieves break in? The landlady must have heard the sound too. There was an answering creak from the side of the house. Then a loud yell from Molly, wondering who it was that was walking and what they wanted on her property. She was answered by another voice that sounded vaguely familiar to Nancy. What exactly he said the woman did not hear, but it clearly did not please her mother-in-law, who delivered a rather long and vehement monologue. The second voice answered her with no less emotional phrase. A verbal altercation ensued. Nancy sat behind Merzav, not knowing what to do, whether to go out and try to figure out what was going on, or, on the contrary, to sit quietly and keep her head down. In any case, whatever was going on outside, it looked little like a robbery or any other criminal act. It didn't make it any clearer, however, whether the acoustics in the barn made it worthwhile to intervene in the unfolding conflict. Nancy couldn't even begin to understand what it was about. While she was thinking, however, the problem resolved itself. There was the creak of the door again, this time very close. Someone had entered her barn, and she had no time to realize it. When in the faint light of the lamp she saw a face, Nancy stared and could not believe her eyes. Standing on the threshold of her humble abode was an elderly woman she recognized without a doubt, though she hadn't seen her in years. Now it was clear why the voice of the uninvited guests seemed so familiar to her. Of course it did. She had heard it more than once or twice, and it was with such cruel and accusing intonations. "Grandmother." It was all she could manage to say before she fainted. Woke up. Nancy was still in the same barn, and she didn't even immediately remember what exactly had happened. It seemed to her that she had simply not noticed how she had fallen asleep, sitting habitually on the bed with a picture of her late husband. Soon enough, however, her memory brought back the image of her grandmother standing in the doorway of her home. However, and this she took for the first minute to be either a dream or a play of her sick imagination. But as soon as she turned her head slightly, it became clear that everything that had happened was real. Her grandmother was sitting on the next bed, holding little Kelly, who was her great-granddaughter. She was talking affectionately to the girl about something, and the girl, not expressing any sign of fright, was telling her passionately about something. Nancy provoked the grandmother, noticing the stirring on the neighboring bed. Woke up. "Oh, that's good. See, Kelly, Mommy's okay. Were you scared?" "She had every reason to be," replied Nancy coldly. "Daughter, didn't I tell you not to talk to strangers?" "But Lisa said she wasn't a stranger," the girl retorted. Nancy stared at her dumbfounded at first, and then laughed half at the ridiculousness of the situation, half letting out her nervous tension. Still, she sometimes forgot that her daughter was beyond bright. But she was still a 5-year-old child with all the consequences of this fact. "And what bombed not from us?" she asked. "Calm down. Nancy, I realize that you have every reason to be both angry with me and distrustful of me. However, you have to realize that I changed." "No, I guess I haven't." "That's not even the point. I haven't changed. It's the circumstances. And now I really want to make it up to you. You don't know me at all. And neither do I. The last time I saw you, I was the same age as Veda is now. Then I remember you called me that and wanted nothing to do with me." "That's true?" Kelly asked sternly, glancing at her great-grandmother. "I'm afraid so, penitent sunshine," replied the latter. "Then don't do it again," said the girl. "I won't." "My good," Lisa said. "How did you even know where to find me, by the way?" asked Nancy. "Well, it wasn't too hard, I suppose. I'm a relative after all, so I was very willing to share information. You were married to a well-known businessman in town. They wrote about you in the newspapers about how he went bankrupt, sold his apartment, and went to his mother's house in the country. I asked around your former neighbors. That's how I found out what kind of village it was. But here, too, you had to go around a few houses in the middle of the night." Nancy clarified skeptically. "Yes, they weren't happy about it, but they pointed out the right house in the end. I had planned to arrive at a more appropriate time, but I didn't expect the road to be so terrible. I don't like driving anyway. I had to go at the speed of a bicycle on your off-road course." "So you're driving a car?" Nancy was amazed. "Not on foot," grumbled Lisa. "You wouldn't be able to get here otherwise. At my age. And I'm still quite capable of driving." "Well, let's say you are." Nancy sighed heavily. "So why did you come anyway? What had to happen for you to suddenly remember I existed?" "I came to see how you were doing. I didn't expect it to be this bad. I guess you've had a bad luck with your mother-in-law. Just like your poor mother." "Oh my God. It's exactly the same situation. It's exactly the same. So now I think you and Kelly should get out of here. You shouldn't have to live in such an abominable environment. Why would you care?" Nancy couldn't take it anymore, so she raised her voice. "You said yourself that my mother had the same situation with you that I did. You hated her as much as you hated me. Did you have a guilty conscience in your old age?" Quietly, Lisa whispered angrily, "Kelly's asleep. No wonder. There's no time. I'll explain it to you in a minute, and it has nothing to do with conscience, believe me. At least not my poem," to Nancy's skeptical eye. She took a deep breath and corrected herself. No, of course I'm guilty before you. And whatever your mother's sins, real or imaginary, you're not responsible for her. Besides, she really is my own granddaughter. After my son died, I had no one else. And I treated you like this. What sins of my mother's are you talking about? Nancy was indignant. As far as I know, she tried to find a common language with you to the very last. It was you who disliked her from the very first time you met her. She didn't seem to me to be a good match for my son, Lisa confessed. But I think I could have accepted her in time, but I didn't have the chance to get to know her better. I must have missed that first impression, since I could so easily believe all the anonymity with which she was smitten, Nancy asked. Yes, different people have sent me notes of pictures that say, "Your mother is cheating on my son," and then that it's not really his daughter. They wrote that she was with him only because of her apartment, then she didn't have one. And then even worse, as if she had deliberately decided to kill him, so that everything he had would remain only for her. That's when I persuaded him to sign the apartment over to me. Like if something really happened to him so she wouldn't get it, and he agreed. I was sure nothing was going to happen to him anytime soon. And then, as you know, he died young. He had a heart attack, you know. It must have been so hard for me to believe. And then, after all those letters, I thought it was a sure thing. Your mother poisoned my son. And you believed it. Then I did. I'm telling you, I really didn't like her at first. Now, though, I realize it wasn't even her. It was me. I was too attached to my only child. Like I didn't want to share him with anyone, you know. How can you not believe something that so clearly confirms his own beliefs? Well, dumbfounded, Nancy retorted. But now what made you change your mind after all these years? Yes, you see, conscience. Not me, really, but the girl who wrote the notes. She's not a girl now. She's a grown woman, the same age as your mother-in-law and mother. If she were alive, she would have come to me and told me that she had written those letters and that there was not a word of truth in them. She made them up out of her head, and she'd forged the photos somehow. All because she was your father's girlfriend before he met your mom. She loved him madly and couldn't get over the breakup. I don't know what went wrong between them. All I know is that your mom had nothing to do with it. They met a little later, but this girl was literally obsessed with your dad. She was watching him. And of course, when she found out he had a new love, she hated her. But I didn't do anything about it at first. I hoped it wouldn't work out, or that he'd remember. She'd leave your mother, and everything would be fine. But when they decided to get married, that's when, you know, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to act secretly through me. That's the story. Nancy exhaled. But I'm sorry. I don't think it justifies you. You have to believe someone you don't know, and literally ruin a person's life for it. I'm not talking about me. But my mom died young, and my dad died because she thought he was torn between the two of you. Yes, Nancy. Lisa sighed again. You're right. I realize that now. But you can't undo what you've done. And you can't get your parents back. But I can at least try to help you and your little girl. You're the only family I have left. What do you suggest? What do you mean? What? Come back to the city with me to your parents' apartment. I've been renting it out all this time, but it's empty now. You can live there, especially since it's rightfully yours. I'm even willing to officially sign it over to you, and I'll help you with money for a while. I've got a lot of money saved up over a long life, but they haven't brought me any happiness. Well, I don't know. Nancy stretched out. In her soul, she was struggling with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, the offer looked just fine. Really, the apartment should logically belong to her. And Kelly would be much better off living there. Honestly, she'd probably be better off anywhere than here. Lisa's visit to Nancy was supposed to be her salvation from all her misfortunes. On the other hand, she saw before her not so much an unhappy, old and lonely woman as a man who had ruined her whole life, and though indirectly, had caused the death of her mother, and perhaps even of her father. It was simply repugnant to accept any help from her, no matter how much she assured her granddaughter of her sincere remorse. There was, however, another consideration that was not at all pleasant. There was not the slightest reason to trust the grandmother who had suddenly announced herself. She might be up to some other mischief. It wasn't very likely, of course, but I couldn't put it out of my mind. "I can understand your reluctance to accept anything from me," Lisa said. "But think of your daughter. She'll be going to school soon. How's she gonna get here every day?" "I'm sorry, Nancy, but this couldn't have come at a better time. Believe me, I'm speaking and acting from the heart. No strings attached. Take it, granddaughter." Nancy looked carefully straight into Lisa's eyes and suddenly realized, even for herself, that she believed her. Some inner instinct told her that the old woman was telling the truth and really wanted to help, or to ease her own soul before her imminent death. After all, at her age, you really don't know which day might be your last. "Okay," Nancy stretched out. "Here's the thing. The morning is wiser in the evening. Come on, let's get to bed. It's getting late. We don't have much room, but I can go with Kelly. Why don't you guys come over here on my bed? We'll figure out what we're gonna do in the morning. You're not going anywhere right now anyway." Lisa agreed. The next morning, they hurriedly packed their things, to Molly's indignant cries. It seemed that the woman had gotten so used to having a free labor that she didn't want to let her go. But alas, there was no real possibility of keeping the woman at her place. On entering the apartment where she had been born and had spent the first years of her life, Nancy experienced mixed feelings. The atmosphere was exactly the same as it had been under her parents, and this novella is a memory of those childhood years, which were still happy. A dad and mom still alive. And how good they all were until everything went downhill. Kelly, who had never seen a city or her own apartment in her life, loved it here. She was genuinely amazed by the simplest things. Hot water, giving straight from the faucet to go to the toilet right in the house warmth, without the need to make firewood and stoke the stove. In addition, the girl now had her own desk, where she could both draw and study. Undoubtedly, it was much more comfortable than sitting on the bed, putting under a notebook or album sheet of some kind, and even great-grandmother, having learned about her interest in math, gave her a children's book with many entertaining and puzzle problems. So Kelly was perfectly happy. And Nancy, to be frank, was glad to be back in town, and would have been glad even if the last terrible year had simply not existed. Fresh air was fresh, and yes, and her own vegetables were certainly a good thing. Still, she missed the conveniences of the city, and the stores, and the noisy streets, and all the other hustle and bustle that had no place in the village under any guise. Sometimes it began to seem to Nancy that Lisa had become a real guardian angel to her and little Kelly. Only a month after returning to the city, the woman managed to find a job, and it was as a sales consultant in a clothing store, with a very good salary. And her life slowly began to return to normal. In addition, quite quickly, Nancy became convinced that she could leave Kelly with her grandmother without any fears. The latter did not dote on her great-granddaughter. Or maybe she just spent too much time alone. And she was glad of any company, and at the same time the object of care. And the girl herself became fast friends with Lisa. Nancy's relations with her grandmother were still strained. Whatever she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could not win her granddaughter's favor. The woman herself was not happy about this state of affairs, but she could not help it. The resentment was too strong. The damage done was too great. The only thing she had the nobility to do was not to turn Kelly against Lisa and not to prevent their communication. However, she would not let her grandmother even on the doorstep of her apartment, and brought her daughter to her. And one day there came a moment when they all rejoiced at this behavior of hers. One day, returning from work, Nancy gathered the entourage from Lisa, and they went home together. Barely putting the key in the keyhole, the woman realized something was wrong. The door was not locked, only slightly covered, and not very neatly at that. Nancy knew for a fact that she could not have left it in this condition. She always checked all sorts of things thoroughly before she left, including coming back several times almost halfway across the street to make sure the apartment was perfectly safe. Inside, however, it was chaos. All the drawers were overturned, things from the closets unceremoniously thrown on the floor, even the beds. Even the beds were a horrifying sight. The linens had been stripped from them, and the mattresses had clearly been exposed to some kind of cutting object. It was obvious at a glance that something had been searched, very thoroughly and meticulously. Of course, the first thing Nancy did was to call the police. The law enforcers arrived and carefully examined the crime scene, but did not seem to be able to find any significant clues. They then invited the homeowner to take a look at her belongings and tell them what was missing. That's where the strangest and most frightening thing came to light. Nothing was missing. Not that there were a lot of valuable things in the house, but still potential thieves would have something to gain. However, and silver jewelry, Nancy, and TV, and a laptop, bought for study, found here in the apartment, albeit not in their places, so the perpetrators were not the target. Robbery, concluded one of the police officers. Unless, of course, you had, for example, some documents or other things that might be of interest to a particular person and were not in this apartment. There is nothing like that, Nancy said, confused. Look, I work as a store clerk, and you're implying that my house might contain dangerous dirt. You're a store clerk now, the cop said. You used to be the wife of a prominent businessman. As far as I know, I'm not implying anything, but I had to ask you this question anyway. All right, if you are firmly convinced that nothing of the sort could have been looked for here, I'm sure, immediately, replied Nancy. Good. Then another theory. Maybe you just wanted revenge for something. Do you have any enemies? Maybe someone who has a reason to hold a grudge against you. Unless it's an ex-mother-in-law, Nancy chuckled. But I don't think the old woman would have come all the way from the country to trash my apartment. You know, I've seen so many interesting situations over the years that I wouldn't be surprised if she had. Anyway, until we find out who did this, I wouldn't advise you to stay in this apartment. But where am I going to go? Nancy was indignant. Well, you know, that's not a question for me. The policeman shrugged his shoulders. But since this isn't a robbery, it could be personal. Not a sure thing, of course. But still, it's up to you. But it might not be safe here. After some thought, Nancy decided that it would be better for Kelly to stay with Lisa for a while. She couldn't bring herself to move in with her, even for a while. Even though she didn't mind at all. Even the possible threat to her life did not frighten her, as the prospect of being under the same roof with her own grandmother for a long time. So they lived for another 2 or 3 weeks. The police promised to call as soon as they knew something, but they never heard from them again. Fortunately, there were no new frightening incidents either. Nancy was even beginning to think that if all was quiet, she might as well take her daughter back home. Sure, she came to see her every day, but she still couldn't be completely calm when Kelly wasn't home at night. After all, if suddenly someone was actually looking for some specific documents, assuming Nancy might have them, what was to stop them from breaking into Lisa's place? For example, figuring she might have hidden them at her grandmother's. And to Nancy's surprise, it turned out soon enough that she wasn't too far from the truth. The compromise that was apparently being sought in their apartment was not even Lisa's, but Kelly's, who, of course, had no idea about it. And it turned out at the moment, when among her notebooks, brought from the village, the girl found a memory card. The kind that are usually inserted into cell phones. Fortunately, she didn't throw it away or try to look at the information it contained. Instead, she showed it to Lisa. The woman, after a moment's hesitation, contacted Nancy. An hour later, the woman was driving home with the memory card in her purse. Some premonition told her that it was this small black rectangle that had caused the mayhem in her apartment. Before she reported her find to the police, however, she decided it was worth taking a look at its contents for herself. What if there is some innocent video of a corporate party? Or an archive of photos of her beloved dead cat Molly? Or maybe the card was empty? Strictly speaking, Nancy had expected to see absolutely anything, up to and including a detailed videotape of some horrible crime being committed. But she wasn't prepared for what was actually on the memory card. After a quick look through all the files, she rushed to call the police again. After listening to her, the officer on duty assured her that he would send officers immediately. However, they had to go not to Nancy's house, but to the village where Molly lived. Besides the fact that the police now had evidence that she had committed a serious crime, they also had every reason to fear for her own life, and they were just in time. When they pulled up, some suspicious type had already finished pouring gasoline on it and was now about to set it on fire with the landlady, sleeping peacefully inside. A few days later, one of the policemen arrived at Nancy's house, where little Kelly had already returned. As it turned out, it was the same one who had arrived on her first call. Now, however, he had an extra star on each of his epaulets. Here, he said, right from the doorstep, he came to express his official gratitude to you. Thanks to you, we have caught an extremely dangerous gang, which we have been hunting for decades and unofficially. What was that for? Because again, thanks to you, I was in charge of the operation. And as you may have noticed, I got an additional rank for it. No way. It's basically a pure coincidence. What does that have to do with me? Maybe so, but still, what if it wasn't an accident? Oh, come on. Anyway, I think you'd like to know some details about this case. I can help you with that. Of course, it's within the limits of what I can tell you not to harm the investigation. But it just so happens that I already know some things, Nancy remarked. For instance, that it was my mother-in-law who killed her husband, and then mine, in conspiracy with some bandits. I didn't quite understand why it took her so long to do it, though. Slow-acting poison, the policeman explained. But a very trustworthy man dies of what looks like a heart attack. There's no way to trace it. The substance is eliminated from the body very quickly, virtually undetectable. If it wasn't for this tape, we'd never know the truth. That's right. Why would she keep it in the barn where she sent me and my daughter to live? I mean, any one of us could have accidentally found it, which is exactly what happened. Well, she kept it as protection from her own accomplices. She couldn't have survived this long without it. They tried to kill her right after they found out she didn't have it. Yeah, it was stupid of her to report them missing. Panicked. Besides, she had no other options. Someone to send to your apartment to try and find her. Although you're right, it would have been better for her to stay put either way, having discovered it missing. If it hadn't been for the mayhem in your apartment, you might not have even noticed that memory card. And as for your second question, she didn't keep it hidden in some old notebook. And then, when she gave it to your daughter, she mixed it up, discovered it. By the way, right on the day you left her, but never found a way to discreetly change the notebooks back. So that's what she was so excited about that day, Nancy realized. Well, that much is clear, but the rest is still a mystery to me. What kind of person would kill their own son? What could possibly be the reasons for such an act? But first of all, Charles was not her son. Yeah, don't look so surprised. In fact, he probably didn't even know it himself. His real mother died when he was very young, and his father took Molly in, first as a nanny for the boy, and then married her. As I recall, your husband was assured all his adult life that this woman was his real mother, but even so, I still don't understand. She raised him, fed him, educated him, was so nice to him. You know, I honestly don't get it either. Well, on an emotional level, I guess her hatred for his whole family was too great. Well, that's just gonna confuse the two of us. Let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. You're right, Nancy nodded. That would be most convenient. Well then, it all began, perhaps, when Molly was not even alive. But there was her father, a young but promising businessman who shared everything with an old school friend. As you may have guessed, with the father of her future husband. These two, as far as I understood, were inseparable since childhood, went to the same group of kindergarten, then got into the same class. They went to university together in high school. They graduated together and started a small business together. Their business prospered. However, at some point one of the partners began to notice some oddities, that somewhere the balance does not add up, or something else. At first it was small things, but then the violations became more and more serious. It was already becoming dangerous for the whole business, and the owner could not find the one who was to blame. He had already checked the accountant and all the staff, even those who, it would seem, could not have access to such serious things. There's no way to appeal to the competent authorities. Naturally, he didn't want to, so as not to incur suspicion on himself. In general, as I understand it, he was going to quietly, without making a fuss, fire the culprit of all these problems, somehow deal with the violations, and quietly move on with his life. However, the further he dug, the more he realized that only one person could do such a thing: his business partner, and consequently, Molly's father. She herself was still in high school at the time. Of course, the owner of the firm for a long time did not want to believe it, but eventually realized that the evidence is irrefutable. Then he came to his friend with a business proposition. He fixes everything he has done, returns the stolen money, and voluntarily leaves the firm. For what reasons? Let him think of his own. But from that moment their paths diverge, and they have no further dealings with each other. It would seem to be an ideal option for a dishonest partner. But he blows up, saying it's as much my business as it is yours. And since that's how you feel about me, why don't you and I just split it fair and square? We built it together, and now you'll get all the good stuff. Anyway, they couldn't reach a peaceful agreement. And then the honest partner went to the police and ratted out Molly's dad. He ended up keeping the business, although he had to sweat a lot to bring it back to its former level of development. And his friend went to prison, and for a long time. He died for a long time, born with some not too pleasant disease. His wife could not bear the loss of her husband, and soon followed him, and their 15-year-old daughter went to an orphanage. It is clear that she started a grudge, considering her father's former friend to be to blame for all her troubles. She didn't manage to get a proper education, nothing at all. All her parents' property was sold off for their debts. The only thing left was a plot of land in the village, which their family used to use as a summer house, and even that played against Molly, so that she could count on at least some apartment from the state. But with this plot and house, it turned out that even this she is not entitled to, because any but housing she has. In general, she left the orphanage angry at the whole world, but most of all at her father's old friend. Lived in the village, interrupted by casual earnings, until one day she saw an ad in the newspaper that a little boy who had lost his mother needed a nanny. Of course, she had no desire to sit with the infant, but when she saw the name of the employer, she realized this was her chance for revenge. She had a lot of patience, and she waited first for the wedding, and then for the boy to grow up, and a little into the management of the business, so that when his father died, the business would definitely go to him and not to someone else. But why go to all this trouble? Nancy wondered. Up to this moment she had served with bated breath. Yes, because she would hardly have been able to ruin the business with her husband alive. And that's exactly what she wanted. I think murder just seemed too small for her, not enough to satisfy her thirst for revenge. She wanted someone from her abuser's family to experience the hardships she had to endure. So she's the one who ruined the suit, the business. Yeah, well, I'd have to say you were her unwitting accomplice. Charles was very attracted to you, and therefore began to pay less time to work affairs, and then even left for a month on a wedding trip, which gave her full freedom of action. But that was later. First, she took out his father. In fact, that's where the gang shows up in the story. What were we so successful in picking up the other day? We haven't figured out exactly how she got in touch with these people, but they gave her a way to commit the crime, and they sold her the poison. That was their primary function. Let's say Nancy wrinkles her brow, but I still don't get it. She ruined the business. We had to sell the apartment and move in with her. You'd think that's what she was after. Why kill Charles too? It was her plan to destroy the whole family. Besides, she couldn't have been too pleased to have you living in her house, and there was no way to evict you while he was alive. He could have tried to start a new business. He might have succeeded. And then everything would have been ruined. All her plans and her hopes. Nancy, are you all right? The woman gasped, covered her mouth with her hand. My back was against the wall I was standing against. The policeman helped her to the couch and sat down, poured water, and only after drinking it was she able to speak. You said she wanted to destroy the whole family. Then I'm afraid she did. She didn't put you in the barn out of some twisted pity. She targeted your daughter, the last member of a hated family, as her next victim. Who knows what would have happened if your grandmother had been so fortunate as not to remember your existence? Yes, Nancy muttered, and now everything was falling into place. Well, thank you very much for the information. I'm not sure I needed it so badly, though. Well, philosophized the policeman. It would have come to you sooner or later anyway. After all, if you didn't know the details, you'd look for them, and you'd still hear them at the trial. He left, and Nancy spent a long time trying to come to her senses and digest what she had just learned. She thought of the incredible twists and turns she could make in life. And now it turned out that her kind and cheerful mother-in-law turned out to be a real monster. And her grandmother, who she'd spent her whole life thinking was the worst person in the world. Turns out she saved her daughter, even if she didn't know it. The thought turned Nancy's mind upside down. She realized that she no longer felt the disgust she had for Lena. Only now did she truly feel grateful to her for pulling her and Kelly out of the nightmare they had lived in for a year. The very next day, she showed up at her grandmother's house with flowers and a cake. The women talked for a long time and cried a lot. In the end, they sat up so late that Nancy and Kelly had to spend the night at Lisa's house, and for the first time, the thought didn't cause her granddaughter's soul any repulsion. The following year, Kelly went to school. Not an easy one. Lisa hustled to get her accepted into a math grammar school. There her abilities quickly appreciated at face value and began to prophesize her great future. The girl studied very well. And no one was surprised by the fact that after 11 years, she decided to leave to enter one of the prestigious universities in the capital. True, Lisa, who was one of the first to notice the talent of her great-granddaughter, did not live to see this happy moment. She passed away shortly after Kelly went to the first grade, after spending very little time with her newfound family again. This came as a major blow to Nancy, although in her mind, she knew it was coming. I'd lived a good life, Lisa said shortly before she died. And at the end of it, I managed to do some real good. What are you saying, Grandma? Nancy was outraged at the time. At what end do you have to send your branch to university and then get married? Oh, my dear, I don't think I'll have time to marry you either, let alone a branch. But it's okay. Don't get upset. I'm already very old, and I'm really glad that I'll die knowing that I've received your forgiveness. The old woman's words proved prophetic. Nancy had indeed remarried, but Nana was indeed not destined to see it. The meeting with her second spouse took place a few years after she was buried. Surprisingly, it happened almost exactly the same way as the first time. A man whose car ran into the store where Nancy worked for new pants. He wasn't a businessman though, just a delivery man. And the store was no longer a boutique, but a cheap establishment. Why do you need new pants? Nancy wondered, listening to his confused explanation. How am I going to show up like this to a customer? He wondered. It's at least a fine. And if it turns out to be very scandalous, so and even dismissal, it's not a big stain. Smirked the woman with hysteria in the toilet on the second floor. That's all. That's what he did. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the store again. It was Nancy's shift. Don't tell me. Half joking, half wary, she said, that now you've spilled coffee on your jacket. Honestly, that was the idea. The man smirked, but I decided to dispense with those cheap excuses. The thing is, I really like you. Let me ask you out on a date. My name is Charles, by the way. At this point, the woman almost fainted. For the second time in her life, but she did go on a date. This time, the relationship had no negative impact on her work. In addition, the new suitor was approved by the most important censor, Lisa, so 6 months later they got married. A year later, Nancy's daughter had a baby brother.